Hey everyone, and welcome back to the Firefighters podcast, where we seek to develop, inspire, and motivate the world of the emergency services operator through a series of wide-ranging conversations. Now, before we go any further, just hit that rate, follow, or subscribe button on whatever platform you're listening to. It's a key performance indicator for us and helps us reach even more people. Now, here's what we've got for you today. In today's episode, we're going to be hearing from Neil Gray. Neil is the Principal Aerodrome Inspector with the UK Civil Aviation Authority and has been providing industry updates to the AFOA conference for a number of years now. Really offers a clear view of where the sector currently sits and where it's heading. Again, this was recorded at the AFOA conference. It was the 2026 industry update covering key themes including terminal safety, the importance of safety management systems, risk mitigation, and maintaining operational focus around complex aviation environments. This presentation takes a much wider view of aviation fire and rescue, stepping beyond the incident ground and into the systems, regulation, and decision-making that underpins safe operations at scale. At times, this one might go a little bit more technical, but that really is where the value lies, because in strong CPD, there is opportunities and a chance to build a more complete understanding of how the entire fire and rescue, and certainly aviation environment, operates and how fire and rescue integrates within it. I'll see you on the other side.
Our next speaker is a gentleman who has a very strong pedigree in our industry, Mr. Neil Gray. Neil is the Principal Inspector in Aerodromes for the CAA and works across the Aviation Safety Regulator in the UK. He leads a team responsible for certification of aerodromes across a full range of operational complexity, from small recreational airfields through to major international airports. In this role, Neil is responsible for verifying compliance with aerodrome certification regulations and for ensuring that aviation safety risks are properly identified, assessed, and effectively managed. His work covers all aspects of aerodrome safety and operational oversight, including SMS, infrastructure, operational procedures, and airport and rescue firefighting services. Neil brings more than 40 years in experience in safety management with a professional background rooted in emergency planning, rescue and firefighting. And this extensive operational experience informs his regulatory approach and provides strong insight into the practical challenges faced by aerodrome operators. I spoke with Neil before we started today, and when I reflected on the 40 years, I think we both agreed that it's gone in a flash, and it does give me a great pride to welcome Neil to the stage as somebody who previously has provided me with acquisition training and supported my own personal development. So please put your hands together to welcome Neil Gray.
Thank you. Apparently, I just walk onto the stage and my sound system comes to life, as if by magic. It's interesting, a Yorkshireman following a Scotsman onto the stage. You know what they say about Scotsmen, that they are the same as Yorkshiremen, but without the generosity. And I think that just about sums it up, eh? 40 years in the fire and rescue industry and the aviation industry, so you probably calculating that about right. I joined this industry when I was 6 years old, when I had a full head of hair and I could knock out a mile in a little over 6 minutes. Oh, for the good old days. And sometimes we need to reflect back on the good old days, because that is where a lot of the good things that we do now are rooted, and how we respond to some of the challenges going forward and some of the new areas that are starting to emerge in aviation. We just need to keep a sensible approach to these things and make sure that we maintain those roots in operational safety management principles. So hopefully some of those things will come out in some of the subject matter that I wish to cover today from a regulatory perspective. But I'd just like to start by once again thanking the AFOA committee for inviting the CAA to speak at this conference. It really does give us an opportunity to convey some messages, but also outside of these presentations to do some networking. And I'm joined by John Purdy, one of my team, and of course Tommy Murney, who was formerly a colleague in my team, but is now doing some work on the hydrogen project. So I think I've got something that allows me to change the slides. So just to give us a little bit of an agenda for this particular session. Now, I want to start to look at Aviation 20, what I've called Aviation 2030 plus, because these are some of the things that are starting to emerge now that we're pretty certain will start to become embedded in aviation as we move beyond 2030, and that will present particular challenges. I want to also have a look at a regulatory framework overview, because one of the things that we're identifying through our oversight programs is there is a lack of understanding of the regulatory framework in the UK, and it's not helped by the fact that we find ourselves with two distinctly different regimes, and I'll explain a little bit more about that. I've pulled out some data from the ICARES system, some mandatory occurrence data that I thought you might be interested to see, because it would be perhaps useful for you to consider it when you're developing things like your task and resource analyses, because these would be precursors to major events. You know, if you look at the events in LaGuardia and Lima involving fire vehicles, or other incidents in global events recently, where the precursors were probably all there and were probably all being measured, but yet the event was still able to occur. So we'll just have a little look at some of those. Won't take long over that. I also want to mention lithium batteries. It would be remiss of me not to bring them up during this presentation, and also some operations by an electric aircraft that I'm sure some of you in the room will be familiar with. I do want to touch on emergency response driver training, because we've just had some further interactions with the Department for Transport, and I want to share those with you. And finally, some housekeeping notes. And if time allows, when we get to the end, because we've had a lot of changes to the team in recent times, I just want to introduce the team as it looks now from an aerodrome oversight perspective. And then there'll be time at the end, hopefully, for some questions.
We're working in collaboration with the Blue Light Show, a national conference and exhibition built around one thing: blue light services do better together than apart. I'm going to be there 1st and 2nd of July 2026 at the event, getting involved with those conversations and connecting with people who really care about doing the job better across the blue light sector. I'll see you there.
Okay, so looking at aviation going forward and 2030 plus, some of the big ticket items that are ongoing in aviation at the moment. First of all, the airspace modernisation strategy. Well, what's that got to do with me, you might be thinking to yourself. But this is a critical piece of work that needs to be completed, and it's going to take, well, the work on it actually first started over a decade ago. And it's going to roll forward well into the 2030s and potentially beyond that, to look at what is a fairly aging structure of airspace above the UK, in order to, first of all, make it available for new users of airspace. So we're looking at things like vertical takeoff and landing aircraft, whether that's conventionally powered, whether that's electric aircraft. They're going to be playing a much more significant part in the future, we think. There is a lot of airspace that's tied up around aerodromes because of old implementing regulations that can be freed up with some modernisation. But UK airspace is particularly congested, and if we're going to put new infrastructure on the ground, third runway at Heathrow, North Runway project at Gatwick, potential runway expansion at Luton, Stansted, the airspace has got to be cleared and has got to give that opportunity for orderly flight into those aerodromes. So it really is an important part of the CAA's work at the moment, the airspace modernisation strategy. And that then feeds into the ground infrastructure projects. There are things like changes in the navigation systems from ground-based to space-based navigation. So a lot of the infrastructure on the ground may, over a period of time, start to be replaced, including that at aerodromes. And that also feeds into the airport expansion with new flight routes that have got to take into consideration things like noise, things like environmental matters, in order for aviation to be able to expand. You know, aviation has for many years had a bit of a dirty reputation. It creates a lot of carbon dioxide. The contrails are there in the sky on a lovely summer's day for everybody to see. And as we expand and as UK aviation grows, then things like the Jet Zero project become more difficult to achieve, which leads us into decarbonisation. Decarbonisation of aviation, it's not about aircraft flying and not producing carbon dioxide. It's about offsetting that carbon dioxide or looking at new energy systems that don't create so much carbon dioxide. So again, that's an extensive piece of work. And all of this then needs to have additional considerations of security and resilience. I'm going to touch on artificial intelligence in a moment, but the security threats are as great now as they've ever been. And when you're looking at extensive innovation, new types of aircraft, new practices, new navigation systems, they all introduce the opportunity for security threats, and those have got to be identified and mitigated in the development of regulation to support that. Resilience, somebody mentioned the volcano erupting a few years ago, but one of the things about aviation, and the guys from Heathrow will recognise this, when you're operating at capacity, flow is critical and disruption is the worst thing for that operation. Not only does it create inconvenience for passengers, but it may introduce risk into the system. If an aircraft can't go where it's planned to go and it starts to look around for somewhere else to go, then that introduces airborne conflict risk, and so you can see how things can escalate. And finally, artificial intelligence. Artificial intelligence in the world of aviation, we're already using it, it's already there. We need to be in control of it. I was at a seminar internally in the CAA, and we've got a subject matter expert, and one of the comments that he made that continues to ring a bell with me is never allow artificial intelligence to do something that you can't do yourself. And I think that is a very good piece of advice to base operational decisions on. The picture on the slide there, some of you will have probably seen the Chinese half marathon, where a robot called Lightning actually completed the course, navigated itself. It wasn't driven by joysticks and somebody remotely. It was completely autonomous, and it completed the route in 50 minutes. Imagine having something like that chucking bags on an aircraft or driving a fire vehicle. But we don't know what we don't know with artificial intelligence. We don't know where it might be in the future. But one thing that is for sure, regulation needs to keep up with it and take it into consideration in development of new regulation. So that's a few things, and there'll be much more. I simply haven't got time to cover everything in the innovation sphere. So moving on to look at the regulatory framework. So what we've got in the UK, and it's important that we recognise that these two pillars of regulation sit side by side. And the reason we've got two is back in 2014, aerodromes joined the EASA system when the UK was part of the European Union. And so we had aerodromes that fell into the scope of European regulations were separated out from those that didn't. Now, when we came out of the European Union, back in 2020, we retained the European regulations for those aerodromes and for those aviation organisations that were in scope of the European regulation. So as you can see on the slide there, the root of everything in aviation regulatory terms is in the ICAO annexes, the International Civil Aviation Organisation annexes. Annex 14, volumes 1 and 2 for aerodromes, Annex 19 for safety management. Now, sitting underneath those, the audience for those ICAO annexes, by the way, is the member state. Those annexes don't mean anything to your aerodromes per se. What happens with those annexes, they're then taken by the government of the member states of ICAO, and they're written into domestic law. And the way that that's done in the UK is, first of all, through the Air Navigation Order. Now, the Air Navigation Order requires aerodromes being used for certain purposes to be licensed or certified. Underneath the Air Navigation Order, then there are a number of civil aviation publications that are developed to provide regularity to the way that things are done. An aerodrome could be issued with an aerodrome license so long as it meets certain criteria and conditions. And it may be that underneath those conditions, there are some variations where that aerodrome simply can't meet the regulations. And those variations will be supported by safety assurance. And some of you that are at licensed aerodromes might recognise that. Now, the other regulatory pillar doesn't follow or feed into the Air Navigation Order. It feeds into what's called the Basic Regulation. Now, the Basic Regulation we've inherited from our time as part of the European Union. And underneath that, then there is a set of implementing regulations for aerodromes, UK EU 139/2014. So if you're a certificated aerodrome, then that is the regulations that you will follow. CAP 168 has got no relevance to the operation of your aerodrome. So you'd be issued with an aerodrome certificate, and the certificate would be subject to certain terms being agreed at the time of issue. And that would mean that there'll be a certification basis that says your runway is this long, it's this wide, the lights are so far apart, it operates to a certain type of visual flight procedures or instrument flight procedures, a certain level of rescue and firefighting category. That's all established as the terms of the certificate. And once again, there needs to be some flexibility, and that's done in terms of special conditions, equivalent levels of safety, or alternative means of compliance. And some of you might recognise that we've got an alternative means of compliance agreed for the high performance dry powders, because you're not complying with the implementing regulation by following the acceptable means of compliance. You're doing it in an alternative way by using a high performance dry powder. So those are the two pillars. If you wanted to know which aerodromes in the UK are certificated and which ones are licensed, if you go to the CAA website and just follow the path to airports safety, all of the aerodromes are listed there as to whether they're certificated or whether they're licensed, and you can get that information. But it's important that you recognise which regulation your aerodrome is actually following in order for you to be able to meet the requirements for the fire service. So to put a bit more detail then on certified aerodromes or certificated aerodromes, so remember I said that they follow UK EU 139/2014, which is a set of implementing regulations that are made under the basic regulation. So down the side of the diagram there, you'll see I've referenced the set of rules that certified aerodromes will follow. The red line that goes across the middle of the slide, the red hatched line, basically that represents a distinction between what is binding in law and what is not binding in law. So the implementing regulations, those are a set of binding regulations, but they're written at very high level. So for the fire service, it just says something along the lines of the aerodrome operator shall have a rescue and firefighting service that is sufficiently equipped to respond to aviation incidents at or in the vicinity of the aerodrome in a timely manner. So there's words in there that need to be interpreted. What's sufficient and what's timely? That's for you to decide. Those implementing regulations, as I said, they're binding, and those are written by the UK government, in particular the Department for Transport. The CAA influences those regulations, but we don't write them. To change them is quite a lengthy process because it's got to go through a number of government processes that seem to take forever. bit like Section 19 of the Road Safety Act. They seem to take forever to come to fruition, but they only sit a couple of times a year. So to change an implementing regulation is quite difficult, and that's one of the reasons why they're written at such a high level. So they don't need changing very frequently. Underneath the line, you'll see that there's an arrow pointing down from the implementing regulations to acceptable means of compliance. These are ways that you can comply, or the preferred ways that you can comply with that regulation. Now, you can choose to do something else, but the onus then for demonstrating that what you're doing is suitable now falls on you and your aerodrome operator. Whereas if you follow the acceptable means of compliance, there's a presumption that you're meeting the implementing regulation. And that's further supported by guidance material. Now, those acceptable means of compliance tend to cover operational matters like fuel quality, like safety management, like emergency planning, like rescue and firefighting service. The design of the airport is covered by what are called certification specifications. So you'll see coming down from the top of the diagram there, the basic regulation, we then go below the line to certification specifications. Now those are not binding, and they can't be because not all aerodromes are able to comply fully with the established certification specifications. Remember, these are written to be implemented by aerodromes across the spectrum, from probably the smallest certified aerodrome would be around about the size of Cambridge to the biggest at Heathrow, but differing complexities. Think about the Highlands and Islands of Scotland. Think about London City Airport and the geographic locations of those. So the certification specifications need to have a degree of flexibility built into them. And that's done through things like equivalent levels of safety and special conditions, where the risks associated with designing something differently are calculated so that there is a level of equivalence with actually following the designated certification specification. So that's the way that the rule framework is set up. You'll see that below the line there, those AMCs, acceptable means of compliance, certification specifications, guidance material, those are non-binding. However, if you choose not to follow what's in the rule book, then the onus is on you to do something that meets an equivalent level of safety. Now, the CAA can and does periodically change those matters below the line in order to maintain a level of regulatory adherence to changes that we're seeing in industry. Things like changes to the global reporting format for runway surface condition are a good example.
I have been wearing Gore-Tex for nearly 2 decades on the front line, working in hostile environments, tackling challenging incidents from firefighting to water incidents and in urban search and rescue environments. Gore-Tex have a well-earned reputation for protecting professionals in the fire and emergency services through their family of highly innovative, waterproof, breathable moisture barriers that exceeds global performance standards and are trusted worldwide. Gore-Tex, going further together.
So there's a tremendous amount of complexity there, but over time we're expecting these two pillars to merge together, and that's what's going to be termed regulatory reform. And that's not just happening in aviation, that's happening in a lot of industries where there was a previous European set of directives. Okay, so not sure when it's going to happen, but that work is already beginning to try and harmonise the two regulatory systems. So that's the regulatory framework. So moving on to the next point, where I wanted to just share with you some data that's been drawn from the ICARES system for mandatory occurrence reports. Now, it's a fairly rough cut of data. This hasn't been refined in any way to turn it into really valuable information, but it gives you a sense of some of the extent of some of the precursors to aviation incidents. And these took place in the UK over the last 3 years. Aircraft damage, so 1,500 reports relating to aircraft damage. Now, aircraft damage could be something that an aircraft has arrived at the aerodrome with that damage, somebody spotted it and they've reported it, and that's the right thing to do. or it could be damage that's been created during the ground handling of that aircraft. Again, the right thing to do is report it. I was shown a number of years ago by a airworthiness colleague some photographs of an aircraft that had been struck by a baggage belt, and the panel that the baggage belt struck went into a depression and then popped back into its original condition, and there was not a sign on the outside of the aeroplane that any collision had taken place. The photographs from inside that piece of aircraft skin, though, showed the delamination of the composite materials and significant damage that, if that aircraft had gone back into flight, could have created a significant incident. So it's really important that the aircraft damage is recognised and reported, but it's also important that work in the airside environment is organised to prevent that damage in the first place. But it's still something that is occurring frequently. Go-arounds and unstabilised or missed approaches. The reason that I've put that in there is every time that happens, if that aircraft continued to land, it landed heavy, it landed long, it didn't quite make the touchdown zone, there is a risk of a runway excursion. If it's combined with a wet runway, with degraded runway friction, then you can see how different risks can add together to create that incident that you will then respond to. PANs and maydays for things like fuel, disruptive passengers, a lot of things, fumes on board the aircraft, personal electronic devices that have gone into thermal runaway. You know, these things happen on a regular basis and can be a precursor to your response, as can FOD, foreign object debris found on the airfield on the runway. Fire, smoke and fumes. I asked our safety data analysts to have a look at this one in a little bit more detail, because there appears to have been an uptick in the number of vehicle fires in the airside environment at UK airports. And we identified that in the last 12 months, there have in fact been 69 mandatory occurrence reports relating to fires in vehicles, ranging from ground power units to fixed power units, fueling vehicles. In fact, one of them was a combine harvester. Who knew? Who knew? So again, vehicle fires, how does that feature in your safety management, your risk register and your rescue and firefighting response training? Drones continue to have a presence around aerodromes. That's drones that have got approval to operate versus those that don't have approval. The mandatory occurrence reports here is a mixture of ones that were approved but somebody didn't know they were approved, or ones that weren't approved and they were hobbyists or people flying drones around aerodromes for more malicious reasons. Worryingly, runway incursions continue to be a global safety risk for airports. And we've seen in recent years, Lima, with the fire vehicle that passed in front of the departing aircraft. More recently, LaGuardia, where a fire vehicle appears to have been cleared to cross in front of an aircraft. And also the incident in Japan with the Coast Guard aircraft and the aircraft that collided with that. Fortunately, nobody on board the commercial passenger aircraft was killed, but unfortunately those on the Coast Guard aircraft were. So runway incursions are still significant events. Now, a runway incursion can be anything from an aircraft, vehicle or person being on the runway or in the runway strip without the appropriate permission. And some of them are quite technical. An aircraft goes over a stop by a couple of metres. That's a runway incursion because it's in a position where it shouldn't have been in. In order to prevent the more serious ones, you've really got to deal with all of them and put in place processes where aircraft, vehicles, people don't stray onto runways. Runway excursions continue to be a significant global safety risk as well. Aircraft going off the runway, either at the end or at the side of the runway, for various reasons. whether it be landing or taking off, whether it's got something to do with the runway surface, a malfunction with the aircraft, human error. But yeah, keeping it on the grey stuff and off the green stuff seems still to be a bit of an issue. Bird strikes and sightings, we'll never fully eradicate the wildlife strike risk. We talked about airspace and new airspace users. Well, birds use airspace as much as aircraft do. One of the things that we are seeing evidence of is potentially climate change leading to migration paths changing, different species at aerodromes, more problematic species infesting the areas around aerodromes, work around aerodromes, attracting wildlife and leading to a heightened wildlife strike risk. And at the bottom there, bird strikes with damage, causing damage to aircraft. So the reason, as I say, for putting that on there was when you're reviewing your task and resource analyses, have a think about the type of incident that you might respond to and what might cause it. And it may well be that within that list that there are some of those contributing factors. Okay, lithium batteries. Lithium batteries are a concern for emergency services and emergency responders around the world. Not necessarily as the cause of a fire, but certainly contributors to that fire's development and also posing a hazard to emergency responders. Okay. In global aviation, there is a significant use or carriage of lithium batteries on aircraft, whether that's in the design of the aircraft or whether that's carried on board by passengers and crew or carried in the hold in passengers' luggage or in belly cargo. There is a lot of lithium batteries. Graham Day took an action to look into, see if he can identify on a typical commercial flight what the weight of lithium batteries is, not in terms of kilograms, but in terms of, how much electric energy in the form of lithium batteries is routinely being carried on a commercial aircraft. We haven't got that information yet, but when we do find out, we'll certainly share it. But some examples of what passengers may or crew may be carrying are depicted there. So on the screen, the top left, that's a vape. Okay, I think you probably all saw the fire in the vape shop at Glasgow railway station recently. No indication that the vapes caused that fire, but they certainly contributed to its development. And a significant number of vape batteries involved. Top row middle, that is a tablet. Bottom left, that's an electric toothbrush. And then we've got a mobile phone, bottom middle. And on the right-hand side is a power bank. Now, power banks, along with other lithium batteries, are restricted in what can be carried on board aircraft. And it's been identified that in some duty-free shops in airports, power banks are being sold that exceed that limit. Well, they're only going to one place if they're for sale in duty-free. So it's something that's worth knowing and worth looking into. So lithium batteries are a global safety concern, and EASA has recently republished its safety information bulletin that it first published last year that sets out some recommendations for aircraft operators and for aerodrome operators. Some of the focus of the aerodrome operators guidance is making sure that ground handling service providers and other people at airports, when an incident involving a lithium-ion battery takes place, make sure that it gets reported through the mandatory occurrence reporting scheme. The other thing that the aerodrome operators are guided to do is make sure that rescue and firefighting personnel are equipped and trained to recognise lithium-ion batteries, either involved directly in the fire or potentially going to become involved in a fire, and what to do to address that situation. So that's the lithium batteries. And that moves us nicely, in a nice little segue, onto something that's been operating in UK airspace in recent times, and that's this Beta Technologies aircraft. And I know there's a few people here from aerodromes that have probably seen this operating. It's been operated by a number of operators. In Scotland, Loganair, in partnership with Beta Technologies, had a special approval for them to undertake certain commercial flights involving this aircraft for experimental purposes. Now, that approval at the moment doesn't include the carriage of passengers, but it does include the carriage of medical supplies, cargo, and other things that this type of aircraft could be very useful for going forward. So what does that mean for the industry? Well, for the first time, we're seeing electric aircraft. Although electric aircraft aren't particularly new, this is the first time we've really seen them operating for commercial purposes. And I think what it's identifying is that there is a role to be played in the future for electric aircraft, not necessarily in medium to long haul air transportation, but certainly in smaller local regional flights, smaller cargo operations, medical operations, and things like that. So the earlier CX300 aircraft comes in two configurations that some of you may be aware of. It's got the conventional takeoff and landing, which is the one that's been operated by Loganair, and then they've got the vertical takeoff and landing variant, which uses a tilt rotor system. We haven't seen that one in the UK yet. The propulsion system and the energy packs on these aircraft are very similar to a high-performance electric car, like a Porsche Taycan. You know, they're high voltage, 800 volts, which is enough to sort of propel you out of your fire boots if you were to handle it incorrectly. They have a range of about 300 nautical miles and present responders with a number of issues for which they need risk information. It's a Category 2 aircraft. Well, Category 2 doesn't require a tremendous level of rescue and firefighting protection. If one operates, then it has to be subject to a CAP 791 safety assurance process, so that it's a demonstration to the CAA that you know it's operating and that you've done your assessment to understand the risks and to make sure that there are suitable mitigations in place. And a lot of that will be around emergency planning and rescue and firefighting to make sure that you're prepared should it be involved in an incident. Making sure that rescue and firefighting personnel are aware of the risks. And also, there are guidelines available on the website for emergency responders, on the Beta Technologies website. And I've put a link in here, and I'll share this with the committee afterwards. So that thing has been operating at a number of airports. I believe it's been into Stansted, Exeter maybe. It's headed for the Farnborough Air Show, but I believe it's not being flown in for that. But it was also involved in some routings around Scotland. So that's the lithium batteries and also electric aircraft. I want to move on now just to spend a couple of moments talking about emergency response driving. And Steve made some fantastic points about the importance of emergency response driving, both airside and landside. And again, we just need to look at what happened in Lima and LaGuardia to understand how alert we need emergency response drivers to be. Now, there was an event at Manchester Airport quite a while ago that it was very close to becoming a Lima or a LaGuardia, where a fire vehicle was cleared to cross a runway, and it was only the presence of mind of the driver and the experience of the driver that prevented a similar catastrophe from happening, because they, even though they were given clearance, they actually took the opportunity to look around them, to survey their environment, and saw an aircraft on very short finals. So, you know, training is important, both airside and off aerodrome. What I want to focus on here is something that's been a little bit of an itch for airport fire services for many years that they haven't been able to scratch. This really started 2 decades ago when airport fire and rescue services, because of a change in the Fire Service Act, became non-prescribed users of the exemptions to the Road Safety Act in terms of exceeding speed limits and other exemptions around the treatment of red lights and pass to the left bollards. So that change to Section 19 triggered some work to try to overcome that, because my understanding from the time was that wasn't an intentional change. It was just something that was built into the regulation and not picked up until it was too late. So Section 19 is being developed, but it's not yet in law, as it said there, and that's the bit that we continue to wait for. Now, I had a meeting last week with the Department for Transport, and I've been told that they hope that this is now, it's already been given royal assent. It just now needs to be signed off and supported by some secondary regulation, and it's that secondary legislation that's important to airports. Once that's done, everything's complete and it will then come into law. I'm told that will happen this year, but I've been told that probably every year for the last. So I just want to set expectation levels correctly. So aerodrome rescue and firefighting services are not currently a prescribed user. Section 19 will extend emergency driving exemptions. And that, once that's in, that will also include the use of blue lights and sirens, and also the other exemptions for the treatment of red traffic lights. The Fire and Rescue Service Act at the moment is quite helpful, because what it does is it enables an airport to enter into some form of an agreement with a local authority to say that the airport is responding to an incident off airfield on behalf of their local authority. And that memorandum of understanding can then, subject to appropriate training being completed, allow those airports to respond airside. The other alternative to that is to respond at normal road speed. When Section 19 comes in, rescue and firefighting services will become a prescribed user and therefore will no longer need to have a memorandum of understanding in place with their local authority. But they will, because of this secondary legislation, need to have gone through a programme of training that has been approved by a chief fire officer. Now, that is probably going to be done by the National Fire Chiefs Council, and that programme of training will be developed. In fact, it's already developed by the Fire Standards Board.
It is beyond a privilege to be able to bring the Firefights podcast to you, and we are so grateful for every single person that supports, listens, shares, and follows our journey. And to help us keep doing it, create more, reach more guests internationally, and make the podcast sustainable, we're asking for you to help. And to do this, we've set up a Patreon page. By joining our Patreon community, you will get access to every single full episode archive we have ever made. Now, hundreds and hundreds of key documents that we've got in there on fire behaviour, firefighter health, cancer risks, incident debriefs, and so much more. So if you feel like you want to join the Patreon crew and help us make this possible, head to patreon.com/TFFPC or check the link in any episode podcast notes.
So how does that then work in reality? I mentioned the Fire Standards Board there. The Fire Standards Board have been setting out the programme of training for both trainee emergency response drivers and for instructors. So that's what will be followed in order to comply with the secondary legislation and Section 19. But there are, for aerodromes, a number of other factors that need to be considered. First of all, the aerodrome's emergency plan, establishing what the area of response is. Now, there is nothing in the legislation that says you have to respond to incidents off the aerodrome. There's nothing in the legislation that says you have to respond to incidents that are within 1,000 metres of your runway threshold. The legislation requires you to assess those areas and look at a suitable response, or look for specialist response. Now, if that can be covered by the local authority, then that is that piece of the legislation discharged. If it can't be adequately covered by the local authority, then there might be a gap to plug by the airport fire service, and that's where all of this starts to come into play. So the first step really is through your emergency planning, have a look and agree your area of response with your local authority emergency services. And that'll also include identifying response routes. Your decision making should be subjected to suitable documented justification to identify how you came about that decision. And that can be recorded in your emergency planning document, which in turn is part of your aerodrome manual. It might be that if you are going to drive an airport fire vehicle in a landside environment, that it'll need a vehicle special order because of the dimensions of the vehicle, and you may exceed the dimensions that are approved for road use. So it might require a vehicle special order. And there may be other requirements for legal road use, such as the vehicle taxation, the fuel that's being used by the vehicle, and a number of other things. One of the things that I must say at this point, though, is none of this in relation to being able to drive on the public highway is CAA legislation. This is all legislation from another body, from the Department for Transport, but it becomes an enabler for aviation regulations, because if your emergency plan means that you've got a need to respond off the aerodrome to incidents, then you need to comply with the rules of the road, which are somebody else's rules, but you can't meet your own legislation until you meet their legislation. So it's really important that if you are going to go down this route, that you have all of the necessary matters in place, such as training. So the training requirements are set out in the implementing regulation that you've got numbered there, which is titled Training and Proficiency Check Programs. And part of that is having suitable governance in place for those programs that Steve was talking about, you know, the assurance that the programs are delivering to the appropriate standards. In terms of providing that training, it could be done either in-house or it could be done by an external provider. If it's done by an in-house provider, then they will need to have that approval of a chief fire officer. So it may prove more beneficial to use an external provider who, and I believe Steve's program's approved by a chief fire officer, so would meet the need, as would some of the training programs delivered by some of the fire and rescue authorities around the UK. And if you do contract out your training, then there is another implementing rule at the bottom there relating to contracted activities. So it becomes incumbent on the aerodrome operator, if they contract out any of their operational services, including training, that they put in place checks and balances to make sure that it's delivered to the appropriate standard. And accreditations can be taken into consideration in coming to that decision. So to put that into a bit of a flow chart there, the current situation, so the aerodrome conducts its emergency planning and it coordinates a response area. Now that response area could mean an off-aerodrome response, or it may not necessitate an off-aerodrome response. And so you follow if there's no off-aerodrome response, you follow the no path, you comply with the appropriate regulations, and you document it in your emergency response plan, along with the rationale and justification. If you decide that there is going to be an off-aerodrome response, at the moment, you need to consider the enablers. How can I do that at the moment? Well, at the moment, you've got two options. You follow the rules of the road, or you come into some form of an agreement, such as a memorandum of understanding with your local authority area, or areas if you've got more than one local authority in your area. And again, all of that documented in the emergency planning document. When Section 19 finally comes into force, then those enablers will be you follow the rules of the road, or if you plan to take advantage of the exemptions to exceed the speed limit, to treat red lights as a give way sign, to pass to the right of a keep left sign, then you need your drivers to have gone through an approved programme of training to the standards set by the Fire Standards Board and delivered by a trainer who has also done an approved programme of training. And there's also stuff in the regulations about each time that you exceed the speed limit or take advantage of the exemptions, documenting it and justifying it. So it's by no means, even when Section 19 comes into force, it's by no means going to be an easy thing. And some housekeeping notes just for to bring us to the end of this regulatory session. Excuse me. Safety Notice 2026-03 relating to aircraft diversions. That was published in February. This is about aircraft that were being denied or declined diversions. So an aircraft maybe gets a problem, or maybe where it was going to is closed because of weather or some other issue. That aircraft now needs to divert somewhere else. Now, the popular response is, well, it's got a flight plan. It will have selected its alternates and it should just go to its alternate. The flight plan is not something that's set in stone. It's basically a document that is used for fuel planning by the aircraft operator. So they know where they're going, they carry enough fuel to get there. They know what the weather conditions are going to be like along the way, they put that into their fuel calculation. If where they're going closes, they need to select an alternate, and they carry enough fuel to get to that alternate. Doesn't mean that that is where they're going to go if a problem occurs. So what's been happening is aircraft have been getting into UK airspace, they've been calling up the en route controllers at Swanwick or Prestwick, and then we've entered into a period of negotiation about where that aircraft can go. All the time, that aircraft is flying round and round and round and burning fuel. And it's going to come to a point where it gets fuel critical. So we've now introduced, because of a declined diversion, a significant safety risk. So this safety notice is all about impressing on aerodrome operators the key role they play in avoiding mid-air collisions, in avoiding aircraft running out of fuel, and having to make an emergency landing or worse. And so now the situation is the pilot reports that they need to divert. The en route controllers then tell a suitable aerodrome that can handle that aircraft that it's coming, and that aerodrome then tells that aircraft where it is in the queue to land. It takes away that operational risk of aircraft now burning fuel, looking for somewhere to go and having no assurance that there is somewhere for them to go and land. So that's that safety notice. Have a look out for that. The current aviation fuel situation, we're keeping tabs on this. The madness that's going on in the Middle East at the moment is potentially going to cause fuel problems for UK airports throughout the summer. Now, what we're seeing at the moment is aircraft have already started carrying more fuel just so that they've got fuel on board. So there's something to bear in mind, that the aircraft that you're dealing with, if you get an incident, might be carrying more fuel than it would have previously been carrying. But we're also monitoring the situation to determine whether or not there are going to be cancellations across the industry, disruption to the industry. We know that there's been fluctuations in fuel costs. I believe British Airways were paying about £1,000 a tonne more for aviation fuel recently than at the beginning of the year. So all of this could, over the summer, create a lot of uncertainty in aviation. Going back to initial comments, uncertainty and disruption are difficult for a system that is very much flow orientated. And final point there is some new guidance on the development of notices to aviators, the NOTAM process, including rescue and firefighting category changes. So that's available on the NATS AIS website. And what's new about it is there's now some templates there to try to create a more standardised approach to NOTAMs, because the end user, they could be looking at NOTAMs developed by a number of aerodromes, and if they're all written in different terminology or unstandard, it makes it very difficult for them, and that can introduce risk. So this is all about improving the standardisation. So again, something for you to have a look at. And I think I've probably run out of time now. So thank you very much for your attention today. I'm going to be around for the rest of the seminar, along with John and along with Tommy. So if you do have any questions that we don't deal with now, then please do feel free to approach us. And if we can't give you an immediate answer, we'll always come back to you with one once we've posed questions to suitable or relevant people. Thank you.
I'm going to sit down for a second.
Yeah, sure.
Thank you very much for those presentations and the content, Neil. I'm not going to ask any personal questions, because I know from previous experience, when I start, it tends to be quite a long time before we depart from each other. So what I would ask you to do now, for those people having watched Neil's presentation, if you have some questions, if you can put them through Slido, please, and then we can pick them up on the monitor down at the front of the room. We are incredibly grateful to Neil and the presentation from the CAA. The regulator provides so much legitimacy to this conference, and for a vast majority of the senior leaders in the room, the industry update is an integral part for the justification for attendance at this session. So thank you very much for your time this morning, Neil. A couple of questions then. One from Keith, and I'm going to presume that's Atkins, because it's based around training. There's been talk that CAP 699 is under review. Is this still the plan? If so, when can we expect the new version of the document to be released?
Okay, yeah, CAP 699, it is intended to do a full review of CAP 699. Graham Day will lead that, but very much a aspiration to do that as it's been done in the past, with industry involvement, because there's so much that needs to be added to that. I know that Graham has been working on standards for hydrogen aircraft, which will be built into CAP 699. So we don't want to go through a review and then have to immediately start reviewing it and adding new. So it's about getting the project timeline correct. So yes is the answer. It is still the plan to review and update CAP 699. We don't have a release date for that yet, as well as the training standards for new areas that are becoming pertinent to rescue and firefighting personnel. We've also got a lot of other CAPs that now, following our departure from the European Union, are awaiting review. Some of them have already been done. CAP 168 was reviewed and republished recently, and a lot of other CAPs in other areas of aviation. So yeah, it's a bit of a long answer to a short question. The short answer is yes, but please be patient with us.
And presumably, Neil, there'll be the same level of engagement as normal when it comes out to consultation. We'll have the opportunity for the industry to feed into that.
Yeah, part of the framework now is that when there is a review of a CAP, that it goes out to appropriate consultation for a period of time.
Okay, thank you. Any other questions for Neil? No, okay. As Neil has offered, and I recognise that for a lot of people in the audience, some of the questions you'll want to ask are of a confidential nature, pertinent to your own airports or aerodromes. So we recognise why there aren't perhaps too many coming up here. But there is one other further question, which we'll just turn to before we break for refreshments. So the question is, what implications will sustainable aviation fuel have, if any? Go on, Neil, in 2 minutes. How can you answer that one?
Well, implications to aviation. Sustainable aviation fuel is going to be a big part of the Net Zero project, and aircraft flying with SAF on long haul, medium to long haul routes. That is the only path to a jet zero future at the moment for those type of operations. The problem with that is when you're looking at things like biomass and plant-based synthetic aviation fuels and things like that, the amount of fuel that's consumed by the aviation industry is massive. And if we have to give land over to support the development of sustainable aviation fuels, then that land might not be used for something else like the production of food. So there's going to be trade-offs and balances for many, many reasons that need to be met. In terms of rescue and firefighting, we have some small-scale test results that we have been provided with by our colleagues in the States at the Federal Aviation Administration Test Centre that show that sustainable aviation fuel is no different in its behaviour to conventional fossil-based fuels, and therefore the range of extinguishing agents and the application techniques that you use at the moment, we believe will be suitable, and that testing will continue moving forward.
Okay, thank you. Thanks for that question. Any other final questions? No. Okay, thank you very much. If you could give Neil a round of applause. Appreciate that. Thank you so much.
Well, that's it for today, folks. Hope you took a lot away from that episode. We started the Firefighters podcast to develop, inspire, connect, motivate, represent, and most importantly, celebrate the world of incredible emergency services operators and the wider sector through this series of wide-ranging conversations. We really love creating this podcast and bringing it to so many people. Did you know you can also find these on YouTube? We do a lot of video podcasts now. You can head over to our YouTube page and follow, subscribe there. And as a final ask from us, whatever platform you're on, please rate the podcast. It really helps us as a key performance indicator to reach more and more people. I've been your host, Pete Wakefield. This has been the Firefighters Podcast. And wherever you are in the world, please stay safe, be happy, and where possible, please remember and support your firefighters and first responders. I'll see you next time.